The Ghost Bus of Silent Grove. In the depths of the Silent Grove jungle, there exists an urban legend that has haunted the locals for generations. The tale speaks of a bus, numbered 1138, that mysteriously vanished one foggy night along with its passengers. Many have tried to dismiss the legend as a mere ghost story, but those who dare to venture too close to the heart of the jungle know better. This is the story of how the legend came to be and the chilling truth behind it. It was a humid, late summer evening when bus 1138 pulled out of the depot, its headlights piercing the growing darkness. The driver, a seasoned veteran named Joe Martinez, had driven this route hundreds of times. The route was notorious for its treacherous curves and dense, overhanging foliage that swallowed the road. But Joe was confident, perhaps a bit too much so. The passengers were a mix of weary travelers and local villagers heading back to their homes. There was Mrs. Carmichael, a school teacher returning from a visit to her sister, a group of college students on a field trip, and an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, heading back after a day in the market. The bus was filled with the low hum of conversations and the occasional laughter as the trees outside became a blur of green shadows. As they ventured deeper into the jungle, an unexpected storm began to brew. Dark clouds rolled in, and the first raindrops splattered against the windshield. Joe turned on the wipers, but the rain quickly became a torrential downpour. The winding road grew slick and treacherous. Thunder rumbled ominously, and flashes of lightning illuminated the dense jungle. The passengers fell silent, unease settling over them like a thick fog. Joe gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning struck a tree near the road, sending it crashing down in front of the bus. Joe slammed on the brakes, and the bus skidded to a halt, narrowly avoiding disaster. Shaken, he realized they were now trapped, the road blocked by the massive tree. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the jungle seemed to close in around them. Joe turned to the passengers. "Everyone, please stay calm. We're going to have to wait this storm out. I'll try to call for help." He reached for his radio, but it was dead. The storm must have knocked out the signal. Panic began to ripple through the bus. The college students whispered among themselves, and Mrs. Carmichael clutched her handbag tightly. The Parkers held each other's hands, their faces pale. Joe took a deep breath. "We can't stay here all night. I'm going to see if I can find a way to get help. Stay on the bus and keep the doors locked." Joe grabbed a flashlight and an emergency kit, then stepped out into the pouring rain. The jungle was a cacophony of sounds: the relentless pounding of the rain, the rustling of leaves, and the distant cries of unseen animals. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing little more than an endless expanse of trees and undergrowth. Back on the bus, the passengers huddled together, trying to keep their spirits up. Hours passed, and Joe did not return. Anxiety turned to fear as the storm showed no signs of abating. Eventually, the passengers drifted into an uneasy sleep, hoping that daylight would bring relief. Morning broke, but the storm had only lessened slightly. Joe was still missing. The passengers, now desperate, debated their next move. Some suggested waiting longer, while others wanted to venture out to find help. Mrs. Carmichael, ever the voice of reason, stood up. "We can't just sit here. If Joe hasn't returned, something must be wrong. We need to stick together and find our way back to the main road." Reluctantly, the group agreed. They gathered their belongings, took what little food and water they had, and stepped off the bus into the dripping jungle. The path was treacherous, the ground slippery and uneven. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the jungle seemed to become. As they trudged through the underbrush, one of the students, Lisa, stumbled upon something strange, a clearing with what appeared to be an old, abandoned village. The structures were dilapidated, overgrown with vines and moss. It was as if the jungle had reclaimed the land. "Look at this place," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "What happened here?" Mr. Parker, who had lived in the area all his life, looked around, his face ashen. "This is Silent Grove. My grandfather used to tell stories about it. Said it was cursed. People disappeared here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The village had an eerie, timeless quality to it, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. But what struck them the most was a sense of being watched, an unseen presence lurking just beyond their line of sight. As they explored the village, strange things began to happen. Shadows flitted at the edge of their vision, and ghostly whispers filled the air. The group became increasingly paranoid, convinced they were not alone. The jungle seemed to close in on them, the trees like silent sentinels. Night fell once again, and they decided to take shelter in one of the more intact buildings. As they huddled together, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mrs. Carmichael clutched her rosary, praying under her breath. In the dead of night, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It was Mr. Parker. The group rushed to his side, but it was too late. He lay lifeless, his eyes wide with terror. There were no visible wounds, but his face was contorted in agony. Panic set in. "We need to get out of here," one of the students cried. But the jungle had other plans. Over the next few days, the group tried to find their way out of the village, but it was as if the jungle itself was conspiring against them. Paths that seemed familiar led them in circles, and landmarks they'd passed hours ago suddenly appeared again, unchanged. Their supplies dwindled, and fear turned to desperation. They started to turn on each other, accusing one another of leading them astray. The once orderly group dissolved into chaos. One night, Mrs. Carmichael disappeared. They found her the next morning, sitting by the edge of the village, staring blankly into the trees. She didn't respond to their calls or touch, her mind seemingly lost to the jungle. Days turned into weeks, and the group was whittled down to just Lisa and a student named Mark. They were gaunt, their clothes tattered, and their eyes hollow. They stumbled upon a cave, hoping it might offer some clue or escape. Inside, they found ancient carvings on the walls, depicting the history of the village. It told of a ritual gone wrong, a pact with dark spirits that cursed the land and its inhabitants. The villagers had sought power and protection, but instead they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of horror. As Lisa and Mark pieced together the story, a chilling realization set in. They were not just lost, they were trapped in the same cycle. The jungle, the village, the ghostly whispers. It was all part of the curse. Desperation gave them strength. They decided to make one last attempt to break free. Following the cave's carvings, they performed the ritual described, hoping to undo the curse. As they chanted the ancient words, the jungle seemed to come alive around them, the spirits manifesting as shadowy figures. With a final, desperate plea, they completed the ritual. The spirits howled in rage, but then there was silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the jungle seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Lisa and Mark stumbled out of the cave, and for the first time, they saw a clear path leading out of the jungle. Exhausted and broken, they followed it until they emerged onto the main road. Rescue teams found them days later, barely alive but free from the jungle's grasp. They were hailed as survivors, but they knew the truth. Silent Grove had claimed many lives, and it would continue to do so until someone else was unfortunate enough to cross its path. Bus 1138 was never found. The legend of the ghost bus grew, becoming a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture into Silent Grove. Some say the jungle still whispers at night, calling out for new souls to trap. Others claim to have seen a phantom bus, its headlights piercing the fog, roaming the jungle in search of its lost passengers. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the haunted depths of Silent Grove. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us, would you dare to board Bus 1138? Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and beware of the unknown.
The Smiling Man.
It was a cold autumn night when James left the office. The clock had struck midnight and the streets were eerily quiet. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way through the deserted city, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. As he turned onto a dimly lit street, James noticed a figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew nearer, he realized it was a man, dancing under the flickering streetlight. The man's movements were strange, almost hypnotic. He swayed and twirled with an odd grace, his arms flailing wildly as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. But what unsettled James the most was the man's face. A wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across his features, his eyes shining with an unsettling intensity. James slowed his pace, unable to tear his gaze away from the dancing figure. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down James's spine. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he didn't want to stick around to find out. Taking a deep breath, James quickened his steps, trying to put some distance between himself and the dancing man. But no matter how fast he walked, the man seemed to keep pace, always just a few steps behind. A sense of unease settled over James as he realized the man was following him. He glanced back over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's grin had widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light. Feeling a surge of panic, James turned a corner, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of streets. But no matter which way he turned, the dancing man was always there, his grin never faltering. James felt a growing sense of dread as he realized he was being toyed with. The dancing man seemed to be enjoying the chase, relishing in James's fear. Desperate now, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty streets. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, getting closer and closer with each passing second. It was as if the man was toying with him, deliberately keeping just out of reach. As James ran, his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? And most importantly, how could James escape? Finally, James reached his apartment building, relief flooding through him. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking with fear. The dancing man was just a few yards behind him now, his grin wider than ever. With a final, desperate twist of the key, James flung open the door and stumbled inside. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it with his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. James's breath came in ragged gasps as he listened for any sign of the man outside. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing but the sound of his own racing heart. Slowly, James pushed himself away from the door and staggered into his apartment. He locked the door behind him, double-checking to make sure it was secure. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. But even as he collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over him, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of the dancing man's wide grin haunted him, a constant reminder that he was not safe, not truly safe. Days passed, and James tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind after a long day at work. But deep down, he knew the truth. The dancing man was real, and he was out there, somewhere, waiting. Night after night, James lay awake in bed, listening for any sound that might indicate the man's return. But the nights remained quiet, the only sounds being the normal noises of the city. Weeks turned into months, and James slowly began to relax, convinced that the dancing man had moved on to torment someone else. He even started taking walks at night again, though he always made sure to stick to well-lit streets and avoid any alleys or dark corners. But one night, as James walked home from a late dinner with friends, he heard a familiar sound, the sound of footsteps behind him, keeping pace with his own. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced over his shoulder, dread knotting in his stomach. And there he was, the smiling man, his grin wider and more sinister than ever. James's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The dancing man had never left. He had just been waiting, biding his time until he could strike again. With a surge of adrenaline, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. But no matter how fast he ran, the smiling man was always just a few steps behind, his grin never faltering. As James reached his apartment building, he knew he had to think fast. He couldn't let the smiling man follow him inside, couldn't let him into his sanctuary. With a burst of speed, James sprinted up the stairs to his apartment, the smiling man hot on his heels. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He flung the door open and darted inside, slamming it shut behind him. For a moment, there was silence. James leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. But then he heard it, the sound of laughter, low and chilling, coming from the other side of the door. The smiling man's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "See you soon," he whispered, his words sending a shiver down James's spine. And then, just as quickly as he had come, the smiling man was gone, leaving James alone in his apartment, shaken and terrified. From that night on, James never walked home alone again. He always made sure to have someone with him, to watch his back and keep the smiling man at bay. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, the memory of that wide, unsettling grin haunted him, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly end. As time went by, James's encounter with the smiling man became a distant but vivid memory. He moved on with his life, surrounded himself with friends and family, and tried to put the terror of that night behind him. Years passed without any sign of the smiling man. James convinced himself that he had finally escaped the grasp of that malevolent presence, that perhaps it had all been a bizarre and isolated incident. But deep down, a part of him remained wary, always looking over his shoulder, always half expecting to see that wide grin lurking in the shadows. Then, one chilly autumn evening, James received a package in the mail. It was a small, nondescript box with no return address. Curiosity piqued, he opened it cautiously. Inside, nestled among layers of tissue paper, was a porcelain mask, a mask with a wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across its features. James's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, a replica of the smiling man's face. A sense of dread washed over him as he stared at the mask, his mind racing with questions. How had the smiling man found him? What did he want this time? And then, as if in answer to his unspoken questions, James heard a sound, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. It was the same tune the smiling man had danced to that fateful night, a tune that had long haunted James's nightmares. With trembling hands, James placed the mask back in the box and sealed it shut. He knew then that the smiling man had never truly left, that he had merely been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But James was no longer the scared, helpless man he had been that night. He was stronger now, more determined. He refused to let the smiling man's terror consume him once more. Gathering his courage, James walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The night was quiet, the streets empty, but somewhere out there, he knew, the smiling man was watching, waiting. With a steely resolve, James made a decision. He would not be a victim again. He would face the smiling man head on, confront his fears, and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. And as he stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, James whispered to himself, "I will not let you in. I will not let fear rule my life. You may be out there, smiling and waiting, but I am ready for you. I will find you, and I will make sure you never haunt another soul again." With that, James turned away from the window, his heart filled with determination. The smiling man may have been a relentless nightmare, but James was ready to face him, to reclaim his life and his peace of mind. And so, the battle between James and the smiling man continued, a never-ending struggle between fear and courage, darkness and light. But no matter how long the night may seem, James knew that dawn would eventually come, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey through the tale of the smiling man. Until we meet again, may your path be illuminated by the light of courage and truth.
When things hit the fan with my parents, I had to move out. I was down on my luck, living situation-wise, and could only crash on the couches of my friends for so long. I was looking on all the roommate and apartment apps and websites and found something that caught my eye. A man named Luke had listed a room for rent in his 3-bedroom, 1-story house. The rent was $1,500 a month, and he'd basically be my landlord and roommate since he would also be living in the house. He made sure to note in the ad that he'd be out of the house most of the time, and that the renter would often have the place to themselves. He did put in all capital letters a few ground rules though, including no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. They seemed like pretty standard rules. I went to view the house in person and meet Luke. The second he opened the door, I got a bit of a read on him that he was a little reclusive. His demeanor was quiet and a little awkward. He showed me the house and I could tell he was nervous because his voice would shake and he would stutter. The bedroom was a good size, and the actual floor plan of the house was good. It was an open layout, meaning the kitchen, living room, and dining room were all one big open space. He laid out some more ground rules in person and emphasized again how I couldn't go in the attic or the basement as he used them for storage only. That sounded fair enough. On the spot, I told him I was interested. We shook hands, I left, and 2 days later, I was moving in. We didn't draft any sort of lease or contract. I was just going to be paying him off the books month to month on the first day of every month. I settled in pretty quickly. The bedroom I was renting was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture, so all I did was hang some of my wall decor and fill the dresser and closet with clothes. The bedroom had a lock on it, thankfully, and he gave me the key to it so I could lock it when he wasn't home, which seemed like a nice gesture at first. Luke never told me what he did for work. He just said he usually wouldn't be home. But I quickly learned that wasn't true. Anytime I'd come home from work, his car was always in the driveway. Quickly, I started to pick up on loud sounds outside of my bedroom at night, from footsteps to doors opening and closing constantly. One night, I went out in the middle of the night just to go to the bathroom and noticed the basement door was open. I walked over to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was a dim light from down there, seemingly from a far corner out of view. I heard banging sounds coming from down there. It was like 2 a.m. What could he be doing down there? Then the bang stopped, and Luke appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me. It was so creepy that describing it in words doesn't do it justice. He looked visibly annoyed as he looked up at me. I apologized and said I was just going to the bathroom. He almost angrily responded, "Shut the basement door." I listened to him, insanely weirded out. I went to the bathroom and then back to bed. I laid awake for a while after that, my mind racing, wondering what he was doing. About a week later, I returned home and noticed my bedroom door was unlocked. I always locked it before leaving every day. I looked around my room to see if anything was missing, and while nothing seemed to be missing, I noticed some things had been moved. For starters, my clothes in the dressers were not neatly stacked anymore. They had been looked through. I could tell the closet door was also cracked open. It was dawning on me that he had his own key and likely came into my room and went through my stuff. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy and a violation of my tenant rights. I had to figure out how to confront him about it. I went to knock on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway once again, so he had to be home. I was getting such weird vibes from all this. I gave up and went back to my room after microwaving my dinner. While I was in my room, relaxing and watching TV, I heard the door to Luke's room open. I took this opportunity to get up and confront him, so I went out to the living room and caught him in a hurry about to leave the house. I stopped him and asked if he went into my room. He looked at me with a blank expression and straight up said no. I delicately responded without being hostile, saying that the door was unlocked and some of my stuff appeared to have been gone through. He then claimed that I had the only key to my bedroom and then said he was in a hurry and had to go. He left. I was flabbergasted by all of this. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but at that time, I hated them and wanted nothing to do with them. I was already back on the apps and websites looking up other listings. I knew I didn't want to stay here. Then I realized this was the first apparent time that Luke wasn't home while I was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to check out the basement. I checked out the windows first to make sure his car was gone, and it was. I then went over to open the basement door. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any light switches, so I just used the flashlight on my phone to navigate around. The steps were so creaky, I felt like I was in an abandoned house. I got to the bottom, and there was a tan carpet that was curling upwards at the walls as if it were poorly fitted to the floor. It was a very small basement. At least the main room there was. There was just this one ugly couch in the middle of the room. There was also a slightly funky smell down there, and the smell only got worse as I got closer to this door in the corner. I attempted to open the door, but unfortunately, it was locked. Or maybe I should say fortunately, because I'm not sure I fully wanted to know what was in there emitting that smell. It almost smelled like raw sewage, but worse. I did one little quick sweep around the main room of the basement and found nothing. Just some taped up cardboard boxes which I was not going to open. I went back upstairs and shut the door. The rest of that night I stayed in my room. I never heard Luke come back. He must have gotten back after I had fallen asleep. I woke up, and the room was still dark. My alarm was not going off. Something else had woken me up. I heard the floor next to my bed creak, and I turned and saw Luke leaning over my bed looking at me. I screamed, and he replied to me to shush and then asked me if I went into the basement. I screamed no and asked how he got in here. I locked the door. He then asked me, "Are you sure?" I flipped the cards on him and yelled, "Did you come into this room when I wasn't home?" He replied no, then turned around and walked toward the door. I asked, "How did you get in here then?" I saw him hold up his hand in the dark. He wasn't holding anything at the time. I didn't know what it meant. He said to me before leaving the room, "I think you should find other living arrangements." And then he closed the door. I started packing right then and there. I wasn't staying another minute in that house. I knocked on his door and yelled at him to give me half of the rent money back since I'd only been there like 2 weeks. Moments later, he opened the door, and just his arm stuck out from the door holding a small stack of $100 bills. He managed to make even handing me the money insanely creepy. I grabbed it. It was only $400, but whatever, it was close enough. I just wanted to get out of there. I was fully packed and out of there within an hour. I slept in my car that night. I ended up back at my parents' house the next day, and after explaining the ludicrous situation I just went through, something changed. They were more welcoming to have me back. I still moved out a month later, but my parents and I are fine now. If you're choosing to have a random roommate from online, just be careful and use your best judgment after meeting them. It was my junior year of college. I had moved off campus into a student apartment building. My roommate was sort of assigned to me by the school in the sense that he was just someone else who needed someone to live with. His name was David, and he seemed like a nice guy at first. He was friendly and polite, always smiling and making small talk. But as the days went by, I started to notice strange things about him, little quirks and odd behaviors that made me feel uneasy. It started with the way David would always linger in my room, asking pushy questions about my personal life and poking around my belongings as if he were way too comfortable doing so. At first, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity, even if I found it kind of weird. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Then there were the sounds I would hear coming from David's room late at night, talking and shuffling noises that were slightly concerning. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just David on his phone or watching TV. But the sounds continued and got stranger and stranger. I eventually asked David about the noise, trying to keep my tone light and non-confrontational. David just laughed and said he had trouble sleeping and liked to listen to podcasts to help him relax. But the noise never sounded like a podcast. It was too sporadic and disjointed, and there were too many voices. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone talking loudly in the living room. I got out of bed and cautiously walked to the living room. I was surprised to find David sitting on the couch, surrounded by open cardboard boxes filled with old photos and memorabilia. He looked up at me with a strange, almost manic gleam in his eyes. He said he was going through some old stuff from his childhood and got carried away. I nodded and backed away, returning to my room and locking the door behind me. A few days later, I came home from class to find David standing in the kitchen, holding one of my kitchen knives. He was staring at it intently, turning it over in his hands as if he had never seen a knife before. I asked him what he was doing, and he looked up at me with a blank expression. He said he was just curious about the knife and wanted to see how sharp it was. He then put the knife back in the block and walked away as if nothing had happened. I started to feel like I was living with a ticking time bomb, never knowing when David might do something truly dangerous. I considered talking to the apartment manager or even the police, but I didn't have any concrete evidence that David was a threat. It was just a feeling, a nagging sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed and opened the door to find David standing there, his face twisted in anger. He accused me of going through his things and stealing his stuff. I was taken aback and tried to calm him down, explaining that I had never touched his belongings. But David wouldn't listen. He was convinced that I was lying, and he started to push past me into my room. I stood my ground and told him to leave, my voice shaking with fear. After what felt like an eternity, David finally backed down and stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The next day, I went to the apartment manager and told her everything. She listened sympathetically and said she would talk to David and see if there was anything she could do. But I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I started looking for a new place to live, and within a week I had found a new apartment and moved out. I never saw David again, and I never found out what his deal was. But the experience left me shaken and wary of living with strangers ever again. It was a harsh lesson in the dangers of trusting people too easily, and the importance of following your instincts when something feels wrong.
It was Sarah's first night shift at St. Mark's Hospital. The eerie silence of the corridors was a stark contrast to the bustling daytime atmosphere she was used to. As a newly hired nurse, she had heard the rumors about the night shift, whispers of strange occurrences, inexplicable noises, and shadowy figures that seemed to lurk in the periphery of one's vision. The hospital was an old building, its history dating back over a century. Stories of its past patients, many of whom had met tragic ends, were a common topic of conversation among the staff. Sarah tried to brush off these stories as mere legends, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over her as she walked through the dimly lit halls. The clock struck midnight. Sarah was making her rounds, checking on patients who were sound asleep. She passed room 308, where Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with dementia, resided. He was often agitated during the day, but the night seemed to bring him a semblance of peace. As Sarah walked by, she noticed a shadow in her peripheral vision. It was fleeting, almost too quick to be real. She stopped and turned, her eyes scanning the corridor behind her. Nothing. Just the dim lights and the sterile white walls. She shook her head, blaming her overactive imagination. Continuing her rounds, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she passed room 308, she felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Thompson's door was slightly ajar, and she could hear him muttering to himself. She stepped closer, hoping to catch what he was saying. "Not again. Please, not again," he repeated, his voice quivering with fear. Sarah pushed the door open gently. "Mr. Thompson, are you all right?" she asked softly. The old man's eyes were wide open, staring at the corner of the room. "They come at night," he whispered. "The shadows. They're coming for me." The next few nights were a blur of routine tasks and fleeting shadows. Sarah tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but each night brought new disturbances. Unseen hands seemed to brush past her, and objects would be found out of place. Other night shift workers shared similar experiences, but they shrugged them off as the quirks of an old building. One particularly quiet night, Sarah was in the break room, sipping coffee and trying to keep herself awake. She heard a noise, a soft shuffling, coming from the corridor. She stood up, her heart pounding, and peeked out. The corridor was empty, but she noticed that the light outside room 308 was flickering. Summoning her courage, she walked towards the room. Mr. Thompson was wide awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "They're here," he said in a trembling voice. "The shadows, they're coming through the walls." Sarah looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The ceiling above Mr. Thompson's bed was darkening, a swirling mass of shadow seeming to seep through the cracks. She blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, she told herself. Though her pounding heart begged to differ. A week into her night shifts, Sarah was beginning to question her sanity. The shadows were becoming more pronounced, more sinister. One night, as she was making her rounds, she heard a scream. It was coming from room 308. She rushed to the room, her pulse racing. Mr. Thompson was thrashing in his bed, his eyes wild with terror. "They're here!" he screamed. "The shadows! They're here!" Sarah tried to calm him, but he was inconsolable. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with fear, and then she saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner, watching them. Its form was indistinct, more of a silhouette than a solid presence, but its eyes were a piercing, malevolent red. She blinked, and it was gone. Mr. Thompson had stopped screaming, his body going limp. The monitors beeped urgently. His heart had stopped. Despite their best efforts, Mr. Thompson could not be revived. His death was attributed to his heart condition. But Sarah knew there was something more, something darker at play. Mr. Thompson's death marked a turning point. The shadows grew bolder, their presence more palpable. Sarah found herself avoiding the corridors at night, staying close to the well-lit areas. Her colleagues, too, seemed on edge, their faces pale and drawn. One night, as Sarah was finishing her shift, she decided to visit the hospital archives. She needed answers. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old records and forgotten files. She combed through the archives, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. She found an old newspaper clipping from the 1920s. It detailed a series of mysterious deaths at St. Mark's, all occurring at night. Patients and staff reported seeing shadowy figures, and many claimed the hospital was haunted. The article mentioned a seance held by a group of spiritualists who supposedly contacted the spirits of those who had died. They warned that the hospital was a gateway, a place where the barrier between worlds was thin. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that the shadows were not just figments of her imagination. They were real, and they were dangerous. Determined to put an end to the haunting, Sarah sought out the help of a local paranormal investigator. David was skeptical at first, but after hearing her stories and those of her colleagues, he agreed to spend a night at the hospital. They set up cameras and recording equipment in the corridors and rooms where the shadows were most often seen. As midnight approached, the hospital took on an even more eerie atmosphere. Sarah and David watched the monitors intently, waiting for any sign of activity. Hours passed with no significant events. Just as they were beginning to think the night would be uneventful, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The monitors flickered, and the shadow appeared, moving slowly down the corridor towards room 308. David grabbed his camera and followed the shadow, while Sarah stayed behind to watch the monitors. She could see David on the screen, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands shaking as he approached the room. The shadow entered room 308, and David followed. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror. The shadowy figure was standing by the bed, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. David raised his camera, but before he could take a picture, the shadow lunged at him. The monitor went dark, and Sarah's heart sank. She ran to the room, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. She found David lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. The shadow was gone, but the sense of foreboding remained. David recovered, but he refused to speak about what he had seen. He left the hospital, vowing never to return. Sarah continued her night shifts, but she was always on edge, always watching for the shadows. The strange occurrences continued, but they became less frequent, as if the shadows were retreating. Sarah never saw the shadowy figure again, but she could still feel its presence, lurking in the darkness. Years passed, and the stories of the haunting became just that, stories. New staff members dismissed them as myths, and the old ones moved on. But Sarah knew the truth. She had seen the shadows, felt their cold touch, and heard their whispers. She never spoke of her experiences, but every night, as she walked the dimly lit corridors, she could feel the shadows watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And she knew that one day, they would. Years after her first encounter, Sarah had become the head nurse at St. Mark's. The night shift was no longer a source of fear for her, but a challenge she had learned to cope with. The shadows had retreated into the corners of her mind, becoming ghostly memories rather than present threats. One stormy night, the hospital was thrown into chaos. A power outage plunged the building into darkness, and the emergency generators were slow to kick in. As the lights flickered back to life, Sarah felt an old, familiar chill. The shadows were back. The hospital was short-staffed, and Sarah was running from room to room, ensuring patients were safe and equipment was functioning. As she turned a corner, she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was the shadow, its red eyes glowing menacingly. She froze, fear gripping her heart. The shadow began to move towards her, slow and deliberate. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She had to protect her patients, but she was alone against an entity she barely understood. Desperate, Sarah remembered the old seance article she had found years ago. She rushed to the basement, hoping to find something, anything, that could help her fight the shadows. She tore through old files and dusty books, her hands shaking. She found a handwritten journal, the account of a nurse who had survived the shadow attacks in the 1920s. The journal detailed a ritual, a way to close the gateway and banish the shadows. It required a personal item from a victim, salt and a mirror. Sarah gathered the items and made her way to room 308. She placed the mirror on the bed, scattered salt around the room, and placed Mr. Thompson's old wristwatch in the center. The air grew colder, and Sarah felt the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing in on her. She recited the incantation from the journal, her voice trembling. The room darkened further, the shadows swirling around her, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. The mirror began to glow with a faint light, reflecting the darkness back at itself. The shadows recoiled, their forms becoming more erratic and unstable. As Sarah continued the incantation, the shadows grew more aggressive. They lunged at her, trying to disrupt the ritual. She felt their cold touch, like icy fingers gripping her soul. She faltered, but a sudden surge of determination kept her going. She repeated the words louder, firmer, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. The mirror's glow intensified, and the shadows began to retreat, pulled towards the reflective surface. They fought against the pull, their forms stretching and distorting. The struggle seemed to last forever, but finally, with a last anguished wail, the shadows were sucked into the mirror. The room was plunged into silence, the air warm and still. Sarah collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The next morning, the power was restored, and the hospital returned to its normal routine. Sarah's colleagues found her in room 308, clutching the mirror. She told them everything, though many were skeptical. But the strange occurrences stopped, and the atmosphere of the hospital changed. Sarah kept the mirror, hiding it away in a safe place, just in case. The shadows were gone, but the memory of them lingered. She continued to work at the hospital, her experience deepening her resolve to help those in need, no matter the cost. Years later, Sarah retired from St. Mark's, leaving behind a legacy of compassion and strength. The stories of the shadows became legends, whispered among the night shift staff. The hospital remained a place of healing, but also one of mystery and caution. New generations of nurses would hear about the shadows, and some would even feel a chill in the air late at night. But they knew they had Sarah to thank for their safety, her bravery having banished the darkness that once haunted the halls. And the mirror, hidden away in a dusty old attic, remained a silent guardian, keeping the shadows at bay, ensuring they would never return to St. Mark's Hospital. Sarah's story became a legend at St. Mark's Hospital, a tale of courage whispered among the staff during the quietest hours of the night shift. Her bravery had restored a sense of peace to the hospital, transforming it from a place of fear to one of hope and healing. In the years that followed, new nurses and doctors would sometimes feel an inexplicable chill or catch a fleeting shadow out of the corner of their eye. But these moments were rare and fleeting. The legacy of the shadows faded, overshadowed by the hospital's reputation for outstanding care and compassion. Though Sarah retired and moved on to a quieter life, her impact on St. Mark's endured. Her actions had not only saved lives, but had also inspired a new generation of healthcare workers to face their fears with strength and determination. And so, the hospital continued its mission, a place where science and compassion met, where the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of the future. The mirror, now a forgotten relic, lay undisturbed, a silent guardian against the darkness, ensuring that the shadows would never again find a foothold within the walls of St. Mark's. As the years passed, the story of Sarah and the shadows became more myth than memory, a reminder of the unseen battles fought in the name of healing and hope. And in the stillness of the night, when the hospital was at its most silent, one could almost feel Sarah's presence, watching over her beloved hospital, ensuring it remained a sanctuary from the shadows. St. Mark's Hospital, once haunted by darkness, now stood as a beacon of light, forever touched by the courage of one nurse who dared to confront the unknown.